This is the gift of compassion, understanding and overcoming suffering. A conversation with Stan Steindl, an old friend of mine from who I think I first met in person about 10 years ago this month. So great to have him joining us. So let me just get through the guidelines for all of this. As we get rolling. We're really glad that you're here. We know that everybody's busy. We're going to try to pack as much information into 1 hour as we can. So just a note of gratitude to the people who have made all of this happen, starting with the late and truly great Faye Honey Knopp, or Honey as she was known to her friends, who was the founder of Safer Society. She was a remarkable human being who was one of the first to say, if we're ever to eliminate abuse, we need to really deeply understand the people who perpetrate harm. And so she went into prisons and did all kinds of study on people who have abused, and the world is a better place for her being in it. We're a nonprofit. We're dedicated to providing services and resources for preventive and restorative responses to sexual and social violence. Our executive director is Mary Falcon, who dots every I and crosses every T in many of our manuscripts and a lot of our other various actions. This is Steve Zioli, who does everything from marketing to layout and all kinds of things. And this is my partner behind the scenes, Sarah Snow Haskell, who really makes these things happen, attending to all the other I's to dot and T's to cross. So thank you to all of them. We all have in common this deep belief that knowledge grows when it's shared, and that this is why we do a lot of things for free, putting out a magazine, putting out these webinars, believing that the work that you folks do really matters, and that the work you do is really important, and that the work you do is really effective. So we've got lots of stuff coming up over the next few weeks. These are just some screenshots from our website, some upcoming webinars. There's actually a lot more in the works than you see here. Coming up next will be Eliza Pressman on raising resilient kids. She's doing some impressive work. We've also got some return performances by Ainsley Heisman, Leah Marshall, Sandy Jung, Alan Srofe, and some stuff from Jerry Jennings and Steve Sawyer also coming up on doing group therapy with people who have abused. We have a new issue of the New Circle magazine that's just come out, featuring an article by Alex Rodriguez. I can certainly send you a link to this if you would like, or we might be able to post it a little bit later on. But this one also is free for you to download. We hope that it's useful to you. So the basics, please use the chat and Q&A features towards the bottom of your screen to ask questions or to comment. Please don't use the raise hand feature because it just doesn't seem to work very well for us. So I just wanted to make sure that I said that. Don't forget that the intended audience here is professional. And so we do ask that you understand the information and commentary in the spirit in which it's intended. And finally, time is short, so please keep your questions and comments directly related to the topic. And feel free to contact us afterwards if you have any additional questions or thoughts or concerns or anything that you would like to share. So the structure is going to be first half as a conversation. The second half is interaction with you all. And then you'll get a survey, and we really welcome your feedback at the end of it. So, whoops, that's an additional slide I didn't mean to include, but has to do with a number of the other topics that we present on. So with that, I hear Stan now. Stan, thanks so much for joining us. Everybody will have seen your bios. So with that, I'm going to stop my share of PowerPoint slides and let's get right into it. So thank you. You've come, well, I was going to say you've come all the way from Australia, but in fact, you're there right now. And just when I thought, how can it possibly be July 1st already? It's already July 2nd where you are. So. So
Exactly. It's July 2nd and 5 o'clock in the morning. So I think it's still pretty dark outside, and my voice is still, so we'll see how we go.
yeah, finding its way. So, well, thanks again for joining us. And I know there's already some questions coming in that we'll get to, but if we could, just starting, so the topic, compassion. When I think about compassion, it's such a big concept. And as with anything like motivation, or for that matter, depression, or anxiety, or a lot of other clinical conditions or big concepts, I try to break it down into its components. Could we start just with, what do you mean by compassion and what does it involve?
Yes, I mean it's a useful place to start, because there's sort of debate a little bit around the place about what is compassion. There are differing sorts of views in a way, and sometimes people might feel that compassion is a feeling, or something that we feel in response to people, or others kind of see compassion as the same as kindness or love, or various other sorts of things. I take an approach, and in the book and in my clinical work, which is called compassion focused therapy. And in CFT, we see compassion as a motivation. It's a sort of an innate, evolved human motivation. And the kind of the definition would be that compassion is a sensitivity to suffering in self and others, with a commitment to try to alleviate and prevent that suffering. So there's that sort of, there's a lot in there. It's a sensitivity. It's that sort of awareness, noticing of suffering, but in self and others. So we include, ourselves in all of that as well. And that's kind of the engagement side, the engagement side of compassion. We engage with suffering. And then with a commitment to try. So actually there's the motivation, or almost the motivational interviewing language that's built into the definition of compassion, that it is a commitment to try to alleviate and prevent it. We sometimes we can't take suffering away, but we can try to alleviate that. And it's always important too to think about compassion from the point of view of prevention, of preventing suffering as well as alleviating suffering. So that's a definition that's largely been kind of developed by Professor Paul Gilbert, who's the founder of compassion focused therapy. But it sort of it goes even deeper than that, really, because there's a whole range, a multi-dimensional kind of aspect to it. These range of skills that we might bring to compassion, such as sensitivity, sympathy, distress tolerance, empathy, non-judgment, care for well-being. I mean, we can, each one of those, I think we could probably define and discuss, but those are seen as kind of different attributes or skills that we bring to this compassionate motivation. And probably really, one way to think about it is may I be helpful rather than harmful to myself and others.
That actually sounds like a wonderful intention with which to start your day. May I be helpful to others rather than harmful.
Yes, actually, one of Paul Gilbert's little suggestions is what he calls compassion under the duvet, where before you get up in the morning and you're still lying there under the duvet, or as we call it, the doona. Yes, you just set an intention to be helpful rather than harmful, to oneself and others. Always remembering that there's these flows that are there in compassion.
Nice. I once had a teacher on the side. I do a lot of yoga instruction, or I used to. And when I was getting some feedback on my instruction, the teacher simply said, Yeah, you just got to have compassion for yourself.
Yeah.
And it's something that goes missing so much in so
Yes.
many different forms of practice.
Is that
Um,
because there was self-criticism there, David?
Probably, yes. And I came to it rather late. I'm not as good of an instructor as many others, although
Yeah.
my practice in that area of my life made me a much, much better therapist
Yeah.
in terms
No.
of present moment experience and practicing making small choices in the moment, very much like doing yoga. Yeah.
And I think this is why we really emphasize self and others, because and for clinicians, this is often an issue, and that is that we offer wonderful compassion and helpfulness and supportiveness and empathy and validation to our clients, and yet we can be relatively critical, pretty tough and harsh and mean on ourselves, and we would never say to our clients the sorts of things that we might sometimes say to ourselves. And so we, especially if we were wanting to be helpful. And so, yeah, I think that notion of self and others and self-compassion being in the mix. Jack
Yeah.
Cornfield sort of says, compassion without self-compassion is incomplete. And I think that's an important part of it all too.
Words of great wisdom.
Mm.
And so as you're speaking, I'm thinking about the moving parts of compassion, this idea of engagement, and also of commitment. And you said a sensitivity to suffering and some degree of motivation to do something about it. And
Mm.
then, as you said, motivation, I'm thinking when I think about motivation, it's another big concept, which is very often made up of importance, how important it is to somebody to make some kind of change and how confident that they are to actually make that change. And our mutual friend, Stephen Andrew, would even add, how much energy do we have to make that change?
Mm.
Good old
Mm.
Stephen.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of moving parts to this. There.
Yes, in some ways, it's a basic algorithm. It's a sort of it's a stimulus response algorithm. Much like other human motivations, such as our threat protection motivation. Our threat protection motivation, in a sense, is we're sensitive to threat, and then we take action to reduce that threat. Compassion, in a way, is a sensitivity to suffering, and then we take action to alleviate that suffering. It's kind of like that, and yet, it just expands from there. And as you say, there are elements of importance or values or sort of, what is it that, what's the kind of person that I really want to be, and we might tap into all of that. And of course, confidence as well, and especially confidence around both coping with the distress and suffering, because when we're in the presence of suffering, we can feel it too, and so the confidence around being able to cope with that and be in the presence of suffering, and then the confidence about just what to do. What is it that we can do to be helpful?
Mm.
And so in compassion, a really important quality as well is kind of wisdom, strength, and courage, and being able to tap into those qualities to really cultivate importance and confidence, and actually sort of move towards suffering and take action.
And
It's
to
very
move,
easy, isn't it,
yeah.
to sort of walk down the street and sort of see someone who's struggling or suffering, and just to think, oh, I just better get to work or something, and sort of keep going. There's a lot there of importance and values, confidence, strength, courage, all wisdom, to actually be able to step towards that and try to be helpful.
Yeah, I'm sort of reminded of the classic social psychology experiment in which seminary students, of all people, were tasked with walking past somebody who was obviously homeless and distressed on the street. And what they found is people were less likely to assume a Good Samaritan role when they were busy and had someplace to go, including when they were busily trying to get to a place to attend a lecture on the Good Samaritan. Um,
Yes. Well, actually, but compassion is not boundless. I mean, this is the thing. We do make various attributions, at that moment of coming into contact with suffering. For example, um, and it's actually really useful to stop and think about this individually as clinicians. One attribution might be, do we feel like this person deserves our compassion? Are they a good and worthy person? Or we might make attributions like, is this person sort of like me, or sort of, familiar, or sort of relative to me? And we're more likely to be compassionate for those that are like us. But then lastly, yes, like, do we have the time, the resources, the coping, and so on to actually do it? So it can be very interesting to stop and think about that for ourselves. What sort of just arises for us in any given moment that might create little boundaries or barriers to our own compassion as well.
wow. Um, I'm hoping you'll be able to say more about that and its role. Many people in this webinar are, work with individuals who have abused others. And so it's easy for judgment to get into the mix. And as you were talking, I was thinking about in a hospital, if you have somebody who's there as a result of a traffic accident, that's their own fault, you don't give them half the amount of pain medication that they need because the accident was their fault. What are some other ways that judgment might creep into the psychotherapeutic mix?
Mm. I think that's a big one, is when we feel like people are to blame for their own misfortune. It's easier, I think, for example, for charities who work with kids who, through no fault of their own, have developed medical conditions or something like that. People are more likely to give to those charities than, for example, charities that might be working with drug users or people who've been using ice and are very unwell as a result. And so the judgments there can sneak in. I think the interesting thing is to reflect on what our own specific judgments might be, what our own values or life experiences might kind of have, how that might shape us in terms of how we see any particular given other person, and really starting to practice non-judgment. I mean, non-judgment was one of those 6 things, the 6 key attributes that I mentioned earlier that we really work towards with compassion. Not never judging, not never making judgment calls, like we do need to make a judgment, for example, yes, this person is suffering and here's something that I could do to help. I mean, those are kind of judgments. But the thing with compassion is, how do we move away from blame and shame, blaming and shaming, either the other person or once again ourselves. That same non-judgment, non-blaming, non-shaming, bringing all of that to ourselves as well when we suffer.
Wow, there's just so much in all of this. You've talked about shame. Actually, before we get into shame, could I just ask? I really appreciated the intention under the duvet idea, or the compassion under the duvet, maybe it was called. Yeah, and I wonder, do you have other ideas? What are some small things that practitioners can do just to help them be at their compassionate best?
Mm. The first thing I often feel and do is really try to bring it back to the body, because Dr. Deborah Lee, who's a clinical psych in the UK who works with CFT for trauma, one of her sort of sayings is, a calm mind thinks differently. And I really like that one. And so what if we can calm and slow and soothe the body and slow the mind. You know, that's often a really important sort of foundational piece, being able to stop, especially in between clients, for example. You know, how can we sort of roll back the shoulders and open up the chest and just allow the arms and legs to sort of kind of gently relax, and lift the chin and look forward, and slow down the breathing. You know, being able to breathe in for 3, out for 3, in for 4, out for 4, in for 5, out for 5, doing all of that to just kind of really calm the body and calm the mind. And then sort of conjuring up sometimes a sense of kind of safeness, safe or calm place imagery can be a really useful strategy as well. Just bringing to mind a place where one feels peaceful and comfortable and sort of calm or safe. And from there, starting to imagine one's own compassionate self, imagining oneself as that wise, strong, courageous, and committed to being helpful self, running through those little qualities, remembering wisdom, you know, that we all just find ourselves here. You know, we're sort of born with tricky brains, you know, and a lot of our suffering comes from these tricky brains that we didn't get to choose. And you know, in a way, we're just the sort of the keeper of nature's mind, you know, and remembering that our tricky brains, and that we get shaped by our experiences. You know, the way that the person that we are today, and the people that we're working with, you know, they were shaped by experiences that also they didn't get to choose. And you know, we just sort of find ourselves here in that way. And that's kind of tapping into that compassionate wisdom, and then strength and courage, feeling strong and grounded and stable in the body, and just reaffirming, you know, may I be helpful rather than harmful. I mean, I've sort of talked kind of a lot there, but that sequence of bringing it back to the body, cultivating a sense of calmness and safeness, and then really tapping into wisdom, strength and courage, and a commitment to being helpful. And it doesn't have to take a long amount of time, you know, just really getting into the flow of connecting with those elements.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Stan. So as you were talking, I was thinking we haven't used the word meditation yet, but it certainly, compassion and meditation seem to have a historical relationship to one another, shall we say, through Buddhism and whatever else. And maybe as a part of this, if audience members aren't aware, it might even be useful not only to look up different kinds of meditation, but in particular metta meditation, which is METTA, or Tonglen meditation, TONGLEN. Not sure of your experience with them, but they certainly are within the wheelhouse of what you were discussing. So I just had
Yes,
to add that.
absolutely. Loving kindness meditation is a very useful part of it. In some ways, different in a way to compassion meditation. In some ways, loving kindness is may you be safe and peaceful and happy. Compassion meditation might be may you be free from suffering. In some ways, I was pondering this again last night, but you know, in some ways that's the difference in a way between kindness and compassion. Kindness is doing things in the benefit for others, and perhaps, you know, wishing people happiness. Whereas compassion, it might be a form of kindness in a way, but there's a focus on suffering. That with compassion, it's about working with suffering.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So with that, could we talk a little bit about how shame fits into all of this, and how are people defining shame? That's another word that gets defined differently depending on where you are.
Well, Professor Paul Gilbert, when he developed CFT, in some ways he really developed it to work with self-criticism and shame. That was what he was really kind of coming at there. He worked a lot with people who were depressed, and he used a cognitive therapy approach, really, And he would find that people would sort of, they'd do quite well at challenging their sort of negative automatic thoughts. But it'd sound something like, don't be stupid. Of course people like you, or something like that. So they would be challenging the negative thought, but in a way that was kind of almost self-shaming at the same time. And so they didn't feel any better. So he was trying to think, how can we kind of warm that up? How can we sort of bring some warmth and so on into some of that work? And so he developed this compassion-focused therapy, really to try to address that, to bring compassion in to some of that work. Shame really is this universal human emotion, very, very painful, but sort of really kind of experienced by us all. It's a real sense of feeling inadequate, inferior, unlovable, no good. And it often really involves us wanting to hide away, avoid or escape. It comes along with various postures or bodily movements that we really are familiar with. The sort of the hunched over, the sort of hand in the face, curled up. And now, but the thing about it that's really fascinating is that shame too has evolved. When were primitive humans most at risk? Well, it was when they were alone. The worst thing is to be cast out of the group, out of the tribe or whatever. Half a dozen of us, we can probably, chase away a lion or something on our own and we're dead. So social threat is very deeply felt by humans. We feel at the core of our being that sense of social threat and that fear of being cast out of the group. So really shame is this socially focused, self-conscious emotion, which is all about monitoring our place in the group. It comes in a way from a competitive motivation or a threat protection motivation. And it's about monitoring our status in the group and noticing, am I being downranked? Am I going down in rank in the group? And am I at risk of being cast out? So it's an adaptive emotion. It works and it helps, and it helps with survival. But like a lot of our tricky brains and the way it works, there's these trade-offs. So it's helpful and adaptive in a way, and terribly painful, and can really does cause us a lot of suffering.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, as you were speaking, I was thinking of the evolutionary aspects of all of this, and that animals very often don't show pain because they don't want to become vulnerable to predators. So even, for example, when one of our dogs became injured, and specifically, like very clearly came to my wife and I for help one day, this was a really, really rare event. And so as you were speaking, I was thinking it's not even just about being losing your group, but somehow also becoming separated from it too. I don't know, maybe there's not that much of a distinction. Maybe there is.
Well, I think it's actually that's an interesting point you make, because I think shame possibly does fall under the kind of the appeasement strategy. We talk sometimes about the fight, flight, freeze, appease response, that this is how we might deal with threat. And for humans, when we're feeling social threats, we often will go to appeasement strategies where we become perhaps submissive or sort of, do things to sort of feel like we'll be brought back into the group. And I think shame comes under that kind of a category of dealing with threat.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah,
And
but
of course,
the other thing that's interesting about shame, of course, sorry to interrupt, is that it can be textured with a whole range of emotions. So we might feel shame and feel terribly anxious and frightened, but equally we might feel shame and be enraged or feel anger. And so it can certainly be textured by other emotions. Shame can be sort of more submissive in that sense, but it can also be aggressive. Humiliation is often a form of shame whereby there is anger or aggression, that where we sort of we might, when we feel humiliated, we might actually lash out and blame the other. And in that sense, from an evolutionary point of view, we're trying to assert dominance to stay in the group. And so we might combat the other person who we feel is shaming us, to downrank them and to increase our sense of safeness in the group. But then, of course, if they fight back and it doesn't work, then we might switch to a more submissive or appeasing style of shame as well. So yeah, it can be textured in all of these interesting ways.
And a lot of the clients that many of us work with will have that combination of shame as well as anger. You've anticipated the question I was about to ask, which is the connection between shame and self-loathing, for example, which would be one example, or the desire to dominate, which I think many of us have probably seen who do group therapy. This is a nod and a wink to many of the people that I know are on this webinar and do a lot of group therapy. And so, yeah.
But we often think about external shame and internal shame. External shame is our perception that others view us as inadequate, inferior, no good. It may or may not be that they actually see us that way, but external shame is certainly our perception that that's the case. And then internal shame is our own view of ourselves, that we are inadequate, inferior, and no good. And so that's a little bit like what you were saying with self-loathing. Self-attacking, self-hating, self-criticism comes into that internalizing of shame and seeing ourselves as no good. And that might be the more submissive version, and then humiliation might be the more aggressive and dominant version.
Nice.
This is sort of the evolutionary based model of shame that Paul Gilbert has developed as well.
Nice, thank you. And with this, I might I actually have a question I'd like to ask myself, but I'm gonna wait a little bit. I saw a couple of nice questions. By the way, you got some great feedback. Stan, thank you for joining us at 5 a.m. your time, making it possible for the whole USA and beyond, by the way, see and doing so well and telling and demonstrating. Amazing, and good day, mate. So,
right. Okay.
so,
thank you. Yes.
Yeah, and so just a great question from a regular to Safer Talk, who says, I have a new client who I really do not like because he's abrasive and has a tendency to blame others, including me. So I'm going to stop right there and say, if only more professionals could be this honest and candid and straightforward. So he's abrasive and has a tendency to blame others, including me, for his suffering. It's an energy drain to spend an hour with him. How might I go into sessions with more compassion and come out at the end of the hour not feeling like I have gone through the ringer? There you have it, the $64,000 question.
Yes. Oh, look at the time. I thought I need to go.
Yes, right.
Yeah, no, I think we can all kind of relate to that, and sometimes there are clients who are really difficult or challenging, will evoke certain feelings in us. Sometimes disliking them, and certainly feeling kind of exhausted by working with them. I mean, one point there is that compassion isn't the same as liking someone. And in fact, there's a great quote by the Dalai Lama, which I won't be able to do exactly, but you know, if we truly want to practice compassion, it's not with those we love, but rather our enemies. Those are the ones who challenge us the most and truly give us that opportunity to practice. And I think there's, for me, I find that a useful thing to remember in that moment when we're having to go in with difficult clients and so on, is that this is just an opportunity to practice. You know, if I can bring it back to the body and use my imagery and engage with those qualities, I can really practice my compassion with this person, and not necessarily literally be sort of grateful to them for being so difficult, but certainly, you know, just acknowledging and honoring that this is a chance to practice, and sometimes a little kind of mantra, you know, this person is just like me. You know, they were a child once too. That really helps me, that when I just sort of think, like, this person was a child once too. You know, they were born and things that they were born with a tricky brain for starters, and they got their own version of that. You know, that wasn't their fault, and then they were shaped by experiences. And so this person is just like me. They have you know, hopes and dreams. They have goals and aspirations. They have strengths and vulnerabilities, you know, and they have had successes and they've made mistakes. And being able to really just kind of breathe into some of those notions and kind of clean the slate a little bit and walking back in, you know, with that intention kind of in there. Not easy though. I'm not trying to pretend that these are easy people. And sometimes, you know, that it can be useful to decide to refer them to somebody else. You know, if you're feeling like it's becoming, you know, just too difficult to engage that compassionate motivation. You know, that sometimes we want to try to give the next person that we see, you know, a similar kind of compassion that we might have given the last person. So that break in between is really important, I think, to kind of keep that compassionate motivation buoyant.
Nice. Thank you, Stan. And I'm just thinking, first of all, into the chat came a lot of people saying, yeah, that's a good question. I'm right there with them. And and thanks for the reminder of things that to some degree we already know in our heart and can always do a better job with. So I hope that helps. And it was the perfect prequel to this question from Kim. It's a really good one, and boy, we could spend days on this, which is, how do you balance compassion with holding somebody accountable for their behaviors? And I'm thinking holding people. I don't know about holding people accountable, but having people account for themselves and their lives can be an act of compassion, depending on the circumstances. But I wonder about your thoughts on this.
Mm. Yes, this is it actually is a great question, and it's really at the heart of it in a way, you know, because compassion isn't about it's not the same as pity. It's not the same as letting people off the hook. You know, but in CFT and compassion focused therapy, one of the sort of the key phrases with compassion is, it's not my fault, but it is my responsibility. And that finding that sweet spot is so important and integral to all of this. You know, the it's not my fault piece is really trying to de-blame and de-shame, and recognizing that, you know, that notion that we all just find ourselves here. But the taking responsibility piece is about saying, okay, but there's things I can do. I can become aware and understand my own mind and how it works, and the way that different thoughts and feelings and physical sensations might work in my mind, and how that can lead to my attention shifting to different things, or my behavior and my behavioral urges coming to the fore. And so sort of mind awareness, mind understanding, and then sort of making or taking efforts to make changes to the way that we sort of relate to our own minds. That's the piece that we want to become responsible for and accountable for. It's really trying to disentangle out the shame and blame, because, you know, if we feel ashamed, like we were saying before, that motivates us to hide away. It doesn't motivate us to change, and so we're wanting to sort of separate that little piece out of it. You work with that notion of the good life, and this is really, I was pondering this, because, you know, like a good life is not always the same as, or is not the same as a life that always feels good. And so this is the kind of the dilemma there is we want to live a good life, and compassion can really help us do that, not because it's easy, not because it necessarily always feels good, but because it motivates us to do good and to be good, and to sort of, wherever we can, be helpful rather than harmful.
Thank you, Stan. I hope everybody heard that and comes back to it later on. And if I could add a piece, because I think I know something, some history behind this question. In our field, so much of the field of working either with men who've been violent towards their partners, as one person is pointing out, or have sexually abused others. A lot of the history of our field has had to do with getting people to account for their actions. And in the past, we've done this in a sort of low empathy, high toxicity kind of a way, in accordance with the research. And at the same time, there's been a number of studies, and I know because actually I contributed to them, finding that very often these people in treatment also say the most important thing in treatment is to be able to account for your actions. And so as you were talking, I was thinking of placing all of this into the context of the interpersonal relationship. As our mutual friend Joel Porter said of compassion fatigue, you know, relationships got us into this. Relationships can get us back out of this. Again, which I thought was just an absolutely lovely point when he was interacting with you. And so I guess I'm viewing this also through the lens of a fellow, I think he's in Sydney, but certainly in the eastern half of Australia, as you are, Jason Ware, who says the most important piece in accountability is also to gradually become able to account for one's own present actions and future actions, as well as for past actions. And then the last point that I want to make, that you said earlier, but to answer the question, has to do with, we work with people who, as others have observed, have done truly egregious things. And in motivational interviewing, we say we need to accept the humanity in front of us without accepting the behavior. The behavior is unacceptable. However, we can have some empathy and some compassion for the circumstances that also contributed to a great deal of this violence. Am I making sense to you? Am I staying true to what it is that you would like to say about compassion?
Yes. Yeah, no, I think that's all sort of absolutely in line with kind of how we might try to approach that in CFT. Is really, you know, it's not about giving up on there being consequences even. I mean, for some people there will be consequences in terms of legally and perhaps their freedom and whatever, and that's absolutely still appropriate. But we can still do all of that without hate, without, you know, shaming, blaming, hating the person, but still providing, enacting consequences for the behaviour.
Nice. Great, thank you. And another question, that's I think closely related, maybe we've covered some of it, but could you speak to the role and appearance of healthy compassion in a setting with individuals who leverage shame or self-loathing to elicit caretaking responses from others? We're obviously drawn to care, but in that case, sometimes compassion sometimes looks like a stronger boundary. There is so much wisdom in that question.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's a great Brené Brown clip on YouTube where she talks about boundaries, and compassion, and the way that if I can have the right boundaries with my compassion, then I think she says something like, I can tread that water forever, or something like that. I think that's absolutely right. And in fact, this is where, deep wisdom comes in, into compassion. What is it that really is most helpful for this person? And it's tricky, that's difficult to arrive at. And sometimes, boundaries, our boundaries, their boundaries, that actually is what really is most helpful and what will alleviate most suffering. For someone who, sometimes in CFT, for the person who really feels a lot of shame and maybe even, it's very present in our sessions, or possibly is a part of their mechanism for attracting, sort of help and so on. Part of the goal actually can be to move from shame to guilt. Now, we really distinguish these two. Shame is coming from that threat system, kind of, socially focused, self-conscious threat. That it comes from that kind of motivation. Guilt is different to that. I mean, sometimes we lump the two in together, but actually, from a CFT point of view, we sort of see guilt as arising from a caring motivation, that we recognize that we've done something that hurts somebody, and so we want to repair that, or sort of, and so that the person who's feeling deep shame can shift to a sense of guilt around certain actions or behaviors, and from there move into compassionate action, and making changes. So we can sometimes see that as a nice way to flow with that person who is, kind of stuck in their shame.
Yeah, excellent. And as thinking about the question, I just think about the many ways that there are to be compassionate that might not fit into a therapeutic session. And certainly I've engaged in actions as a fellow human being that ended up being highly successful and compassionate, but not necessarily easy, but that I couldn't do while working within the carefully defined scope of my license to practice. And so it really does come in many forms, and everybody's circumstances will be a bit different. Kristen, who is I think going to be a guest in a few weeks, welcome, Kristen, is asking, can you speak to the idea of tough compassion as a way to assist with having difficult conversations? Incredibly, that's exactly what I was just talking about, as a way to assist with having difficult conversations, such as those we might need to have with those who hold extreme views. Thank you, Kristen.
The key for me is the kind of the motivational system that we're in. So if we are in our own threat system, and suddenly our own threat protection motive is activated, and we're talking tough with people, or we're setting boundaries, or we're approaching them in that way, but it's coming from threat protection, then to me that might be sort of less helpful. But if we're maintaining our own caring motivation, compassionate motivation, and we're able to approach people with boundaries, with clarity, assertiveness, and so on, then that to me feels very, very helpful. Kristen Neff, Kristen Neff, has written a book recently called Fierce Self-Compassion. And my initial thought was, oh, fierce sounds angry and violent and, sort of terrifying in a way. But, the way that she's really using that term is still coming from this compassionate motivation. The fierce self-compassion is about being able to really have that sort of a righteous anger about, advocating for what is fair and good and just for people and for ourselves, being able to advocate in that sense for ourselves. So it's a fierce self-compassion, but it's coming from that caring and compassionate motivation. And so this is where it's just so important not only to notice the motivations and sort of the kind of the backgrounds of the person that we're working with, but where am I right now? Where am I sitting? And I think if the person is suffering and has their threat system activated, they're going to do all sorts of things that are difficult. But then if we're then having our threat system activated too, and we're sort of pushing back on that, then suddenly we've got this kind of, threat system interaction happening that is unhelpful. So being able to be aware of our own motivational system, what's behind each next thing that we're going to do? What's the motive there?
Nice. And before I come to Tonu's question, he's got a great one coming up. As you're speaking, I'm thinking about a principle that at least I try to practice when I'm talking with clients, which is if I'm going to demonstrate empathy, I need to really, truly be grounded in myself, because so many of our clients have had empathy used against them in the same way that maybe a hunter understands the mindset of his or her prey, or that truly nasty, sadistic people may use knowledge of the people that they're causing harm to's mindsets as well. And so I've always found being physically, as you said, grounded can be a way to help build a bridge between empathy and demonstrated empathy, perceived empathy, and all of it fitting into compassion, sort of in line with what you were just saying.
Yeah, I think this is another interesting debate, compassion and empathy. And from a compassionate mind or compassion focused therapy point of view, we certainly see empathy as a skill or competency, and it can be used again for different motives. So
and can be learned. Yeah.
Sorry?
I was going to say, and it can be learned and practiced and improved. Yes, as you said.
It can be, but the key is still, what is the motivation behind it? Because if we were to teach someone who has, sort of difficult kind of sort of motivations, and they are better at empathy, then they get better at doing, harm potentially.
Yeah.
And so again, empathy is the competency and compassion is the motivation.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Stan. Tonu in Estonia, welcome. It's great to see you here. And I always hope I'm saying your name correctly. Asks, how can we help someone to forgive themselves for something horrible that they've done? Excellent question. Any thoughts?
Well, absolutely. And in the gifts of compassion in the book that you mentioned at the start, we have a chapter at the end there, which is really how can we sort of cultivate forgiveness? Well, forgiveness for others as well when perhaps they've harmed us, and self-forgiveness. That we're, is there a way for us to, and that really becomes a part of that notion of shifting from shame through to guilt, through to compassion, and ultimately, forgiveness. And so that sort of journey along the way, forgiveness is absolutely an act of compassion or self-compassion. There are little practices actually that are sort of spelled out in the book, and that we often use, again, meditative or imagery practices. May I begin to forgive what I've done to harm, others, or And so we start to use little kind of meditations for moving towards forgiveness.
Excellent. And I just have to point out, Stan, that of all of the people I've spoken to who had a book that they could try to sell, you've pitched your book the least of just about anybody I've interviewed. So, good for you. And I see the link. Thank you for putting up the link. It's available at Amazon. That's the American Amazon that we've just posted the link to. I guess one thing I would really like to ask you about, and this is really my question, although Carol also says I like to encourage my clients to move from guilt and shame and move towards regret and remorse. And my own response to that is very often I have said to some clients, look, the rest of us, we forgave you a long, long time ago. That really what we're hoping for on your behalf is that you will forgive yourself, but also move forward into developing a lifestyle that's incompatible with domestic violence or sex offending or what have you. So, as you said before, balancing the stuff that we're here to talk about in treatment with a truly compassionate approach. My question has to do with, I'm going to guess that many of us work in larger agencies. I'll just say, I myself have experienced a deep moral injury of working in a setting where the people in charge did not have the best interests of clients at heart, or were willing to engage in actions that were contrary to the best interests of clients. It's probably as far as I should go with that, but I'll just say the moral injury that comes from working in difficult settings. Do you have any thoughts about that and how it fits with compassion? Sorry.
Yeah, well, probably the one little thought that comes to mind is just the notion of actually, compassion flows in three directions. And so compassion for others is something that we have talked a lot about today. How do we cultivate that compassion for our clients and sort of work with them most effectively? The second is self-compassion, being able to offer ourselves that same sort of compassion, and that seems to be really important in getting the balance there between compassion for others and compassion for the self. And then the third flow actually is being open to receiving compassion from others. And I think this becomes particularly relevant in and around moral injury or compassion fatigue, or sort of those elements of our work where oftentimes clinicians are very, very good at being compassionate towards others, but sometimes more reluctant to open themselves up to receiving compassion from others. And so that there's often work to do there. How can we, when we're feeling some of that moral injury, when we're feeling exhausted or burnt out, or when we're feeling, the other topic that I think we were discussing before we started, this clinician shame, when we're feeling like we're not doing good enough, where our work's not, we're not helpful, or, we're inadequate in our work, on a number of those fronts where we're feeling it too, the challenge is to think, how might I just open myself up to receiving compassion or care or support or encouragement, validation from others, and really, again, the relationships there, and that humans are just, we're a hyper-social species, aren't we? And sometimes we're hopeless at it at the same time. But this is our superpower as well. That if we can engage with the three flows of compassion, then we're able, I think, to really cope our way through a lot of those difficulties at work.
Fantastic. And on this note, we've come to the end of our time. As always, it's the fastest hour of my week. Dr. Stan Steindl, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us, especially talking about compassion before the rest of your family is even awake. Should constitute some form of torture as defined by the UN. I'm sorry, I don't really mean that. I see you've gotten some very high praise from Ola in Poland. Thank you for joining us. I'm so glad that you were able to. And Lauren Walker in Hawaii, I just want to mention, also commented on Alan Jenkins's timeless work in his classic book, Invitations to Responsibility. If you can find it, I think it's out of print, but there's usually used copies around. So just want to say thank you once again. And with that, I'm just going to end the call. And Stan, I'll email you later, but thanks again for joining us. And thanks for everyone for attending. Take good care.
Thank you, David, and thank you, everyone.
We'll see you. Bye-bye.